You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Hello and welcome to TFM's local books and comic show for Star Trek, and I'm just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and with me, back from Las Vegas, Casey Pettitt.
Well, hello.
Hey, man.
It was... It's so hot down there.
Yes,
but
yes.
It was lots of fun. Met
awesome.
some Star Trek folks, and
what?
Yeah.
Really?
I know.
There were Star Trek folks there?
There were Star Trek folks at
convention?
At the Star Trek convention.
That doesn't make it... wow. Oh,
yeah.
Goodness. Well, I'm super excited for you that you got a chance to go. I've never been to the Star Trek convention, but having been to Celebration for Star Wars, I know how much fun it is. So, heck, you met Ezri Dax in person, so that's pretty awesome. And I'm not jealous
at
all.
Sweet as she is on the show.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm looking for a new co-host, everyone. Anyway, but we've got some great things to talk about here. We've got some fun news items because we've got some comics that have come out we're going to review. But before we do that, and of course, as always, we're just so glad that you're listening here to Literary Treks. And if you want to help us out, if you're on a specific podcatcher or app that allows you to review or rate podcasts like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, do that for us. Do that for Literary Treks. Help us out in that way. Of course, subscribe so you get the show as soon as it drops wherever you're getting your podcasts. Of course, you could also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/TrekFM. We're on Twitter at TrekFM. Instagram at TrekFM. We've got the Listeners Only discussion group, the Babel Conference on Facebook you can join. Of course, online at Trek.fm. And if you really want to help us out, you could do that like someone like Casey Pettitt or Greg Rosier, who are both associate producers here at Literary Treks, through Patreon. And Patreon allows you to be able to support the network financially because there's just no way we can do this on our own, and we could definitely use your support. So go over to patreon.com/TrekFM and do see how you can be part of our team. Okay. So, Casey, we've got two new comics that have come out. One is Mirror War 8, and we're beginning to kind of get towards the end of the series, and, everything's hitting the fan now. And I would say, so much happened in this issue, which, we'd been complaining that hadn't been happening, and, well, now it's all happening.
Yeah, it was nice in the last issue getting some action, and it was... I feel like this series has finally found its legs. There's a story that's moving forward. A lot of stuff happens. Like you said, everything's hitting the fan. And I feel like this is a proper mirror universe story, or like we're continuing from the last issue, like just a really proper one. We didn't need all that build up that we had, but I feel like we're really getting into an interesting story that we've been waiting for. And it's, especially if you read the last issue, this one is definitely, I think, worth picking up and taking a look at, because I think it's setting up even more to come that I think is going to be very interesting in the remaining issues.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I would 100% agree with you that I feel like this series completely wasted 6 issues.
Yep.
And now all of a sudden it's hit the ground running and big things are happening. And we're going to give some spoilers here for both of the comics. So just if you don't want to hear them, you can skip ahead. But Here, I mean, the fact that we finally get this huge turnover on the Enterprise of Riker enacting this plan to overthrow Picard, who's become increasingly crazy. And then that working itself out to him being made Emperor because he sends a bomb to with Troy. They send a bomb to the Imperial throne room, and it kills everyone, and then Riker gets voted in as the new emperor by promising everybody more money. I mean, there's so much happening in this issue, and I'm just so kind of surprised that, like you said, what in the world was going on in those first few issues that we couldn't basically have just kind of almost maybe done a couple of setup issues and then just jumped right to this?
Yeah, I feel like there was a lot of unnecessary character development, if you can call it that, in the early issues. Because, yeah, like you said, this one...
How dare you develop character? I mean...
I know.
Well, was it really character development?
Well,
yeah, that's the question.
It is. And, this one was a lot of fun because I feel like with the twists and turns that happened, especially with Riker killing Picard, who, has been, even by Mirror Universe standards, has been kind of off his rocker, and, they're all raising an eyebrow, kind of wondering what's going on, but it was actually kind of a nice turn of events to see, and then him getting installed as Emperor was almost a little out of the blue, but at the same time, it kind of, especially for this issue, really fit for kind of how the story is being told. Him taking over the Enterprise, now he's taking over the Empire, and we got rid of that Emperor that was just in a coma the whole time. That again was kind of another one of those things. It was like, what the heck is going on with this? But okay,
that was crazy. No, I mean, so to me, this issue and the last issue, it's like, okay, these are really worth reading. I mean, I would recommend anybody who's a Star Trek fan picking up these two issues and having a good time with them, because it really, in many ways, the Mirror Universe is just about having a good time, because it's all about kind of crazy wish fulfillment, in the sense that, this is our darkest fantasies, I guess, come to life. That's the Mirror Universe, and so I think this really fits that bill of that. And so, yeah, I would highly recommend that one. It seems like you would recommend issue 8 as well.
I would, and I'm intrigued because the last couple panels, Guinan comes back. We've seen her a couple times, and kind of wondering what she's got going on, and so. Yeah, I'd recommend picking up the last issue, this issue, and I mean, the next issue remains to be seen, but if it's, on par with these last couple, I'm really looking forward to seeing where the remainder of these issues go.
I 100% there with you. And so we have a new series that has just started. It's a limited comic series here. I think it's the 3-part series, which is going to be kind of filling in the gaps between Picard Season 2 and Season 3, which, of course, talked about that here on the Artificial Tango with Chris, and we both really enjoyed the Season 2 entry for Picard. And this is a really interesting comic, and so I'm really fascinated here to get your take on, because we are dealing with a lot of things. One of the things that we deal with is the fact that Seven seemed to be in command of the Stargazer when we left that series, and she's not now. And not only that, but she makes the decision after taking Picard's new Kobayashi Maru test that her life needs more kineticism in it, and that leads her back to being a Fenris Ranger. And so I have to ask you how you feel about that.
This makes me even more curious on how they're going to treat things in Season 3, because, like you said, she did get a field promotion to the commander of the Stargazer at the end of Season 2. It felt a little out of place at the time, but at the same time, the reason that she was put in command made sense, and that kind of made it exciting that Seven was going to command a starship. So in this one, to see her in a Starfleet uniform, for one thing, was really cool, even if it was just within a simulation. But her conversations with Picard, I feel like, were very true to both characters. Picard's kind of saying this new Kobayashi Maru is kind of a new test, basically. Like, not all battles are fought, in space with ships and everything. Sometimes they're fought around a negotiating table. And she's coming to find, as she's learning about who she is as a human, as a person, that's not her. She kind of wants to be out in the fight. And I thought it was a really fun exploration of the character, especially having her and Picard together, since they share history that's really, with the Borg and everything. And he's almost like a new mentor to her.
I don't know what to think of it yet. My thought process is this, though. My first reaction is not great. Because Seven really seemed to come into her own and put away a lot of her demons, it felt like, in season 2. And this feels like a step backwards to me for the character, that she just seemed so much more confident in herself and more comfortable in herself and so much more willing to kind of let go and more peaceful and all that. And so all of a sudden, I feel like to then throw her back into this place where she's like, no, I just need more action. She's like, is this an Elvis song? A little less action, a little more, a little less conversation, a little more action, please. I don't know. Do you see does that make sense where I'm struggling with this with the end of season 2?
Yeah, no, I think that does. I mean, if you're kind of looking at it as they're kind of almost unwinding her character a little bit from the development she made in season 2, I guess the kind of the way that I'm looking at it is she was still in the Fenris Rangers at the beginning of season 2, and I'm not sure what the time period was of that season, like how many days or weeks or months. It didn't feel like a very long time that they were, their mission to the past. And if that's the case, it's a little easier for me. She's like, she went on one mission, maybe she found herself, but now she's back home and still questioning herself. At the same time, no, I totally understand your point of, she did make some leaps forward in her character, and this does kind of undo that a little bit, which makes it curious to see what they'll do in season 3, especially since this was written with the aid, or Kristen Beyer might have actually been one of the authors.
Her and Mike Johnson wrote this. So I don't know. I guess I'm just saying it just seems a little bit to me, and I think you rightly put it, this idea, it's like there were 2 steps forward and we took 1 step back. And so we could continue talking about that forever, but in all reality, we need to wait till the next issues come out to, I think, really get an understanding of this whole situation, and that's part of reading comics. So the next thing that I guess I was also frustrated by is the fact that the relationship between Laris and Picard seems to have gone nowhere. Are you serious?
Yeah, in fact, she seems like season 1 Laris, like beginning of season 1 Laris. That she's just super annoyed by him, and he kind of is oblivious to her, almost like he doesn't even have any feelings for her, is kind of how it feels, which is very much not how we saw things at the end of season 2. And we know that relationship was something that he was kind of blind to, I think, early on, but at the same, especially at the beginning of season 2. But I think by the end of those events, he really had a good idea of what his feelings for her were.
Yep.
I seem to remember a passionate kiss with them. I can't remember.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And this feels like two people who she's still just an employee of his.
Yeah.
In this comic.
I mean, it just feels like that whole stupid Charmin commercial. Roll it back, everybody. It's like that's exactly what they did. It's like they put all the toys back in the toy box after season 2 as if it didn't even happen. And in all honesty, it makes me kind of mad. And I'm like, okay, so I watched season 2. We had all this character development, not only for somebody like Seven, but also for Picard. That was the whole point of this series. And now we're back to like Picard yearning for space and like needing to be out there. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, and so I'm just left very frustrated. So I guess lastly, before, I don't want to go on a whole rant because I will. Picard ends up on the Stargazer as an advisor to a planet that he has previous experience with when he was on the Stargazer. That has to do with the Romulans and him. And so we end up at the end of the comic where they come to the planet and there's nobody on it. And this planet had a huge pre-warp civilization. And Seven's there at the end saying there are some problems Starfleet isn't equipped to solve, and we're left as the cliffhanger. Okay. I mean, like, I want to love this comic because it's written by Kirsten Beyer, and I think the art is beautiful, but I am just so confused by this comic in the first place because I don't get what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I agree. First of all, yes, the art is amazing in this. Yeah, it's gorgeous to look at. It was fun seeing kind of the flashback scenes with Picard on the original Stargazer and some of the characters that were developed by Michael Jan Friedman in his Stargazer novels. And I feel like this is one of those times where that setup, well, that's exactly what this comic is. It really is just the first chapter, and we're just getting set up. And so, when everything happens on the planet, we have no feeling for this. Like, everybody's gone. The place is kind of destroyed. And with Seven showing up at the end, I almost feel like there was this kind of, whether it was IDW or, like Kirsten Beyer herself or somebody, with the show that was like, we need a Picard and Seven comic. Let's figure out how to make that happen. And so her going back to the Fenris Rangers at the beginning of this comic was almost just to set up her coming back to save the day later on in this comic series. So, yeah, it's really hard to judge, especially this one, without seeing the other two. And yeah, I guess it remains to be seen. Like if you're a fan of Picard and, you really want some continuity between the seasons, this might be worth picking up, this series just for that kind of bridge. Since even though it's not canon, it's going to be somehow tied into the show, and knowing how they've done it in the past, we'll probably get one little callback in the first episode of Picard season 3 to something that happened in this series. But I don't know. It remains to be seen. It's kind of a big question mark for me right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I find myself in the same position. And I guess I find myself also just in the place being really frustrated because to me, this comic seems like if it could be written as if season 2 never happened and it came right after season 1. And to me, that's not good writing. And so, but maybe the next two will redeem that. And I really hope so, because, the idea of this comic is really cool to fill in the gaps there. And I think, again, the artwork is gorgeous. I love it. I want to believe that this story feels more connected with Picard season 2. And I guess, maybe that's just the problem with Picard in general, is that, season 2 of Picard felt like you could really watch it without necessarily having seen season 1, because it's such a kind of course correction.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. I just find myself frustrated.
Yeah. That's a good point, though, that this does feel like it would fit. Just this one story by itself feels like it would fit better between seasons 1 and 2. And I think that there was a comic around that time, or maybe it was they had the Countdown to Picard comics, but I almost wonder, had they started a comic series for between 1 and 2, but then kind of did another course correction, once they started developing season 2, and then repurposed a story for this period. I don't know. Guess we'll find out.
Yeah, that's a great question. But, why don't we, do a little bit of a challenge, Casey, and dive into our final book of the New Earth series?
Yes.
Okay, as they say, it looks like we made it. But we're here, Casey, at the last book in the New Earth series. It's called Challenger, and a ton happens in this book. And one of the most interesting things to me, and we're going to talk all about this book in kind of like not necessarily any chronological order per se, but one of the things that happens in this book is that Kirk and Spock end up on the Enterprise by themselves, in the sense that they don't have their third member of the Trinity of McCoy. And we see how that relationship plays out. And I thought that the writing here was really well done to drive home just how important all three of these characters are together, especially the relationship between McCoy and Spock for Spock, because there's a thing that McCoy does for Spock, which has allowed him to, as the author mentions, depressurize, that Kirk doesn't quite have that ability. And I thought Diane Carey just kind of nailed the, triangle relationship of these characters and how much they need each other, but especially those two.
Yeah, that's that was one of the really great things about this book. And, Diane Carey is one of the most prolific Star Trek authors out there, from, kind of the original long run of Star Trek novels. And she actually has written a lot in the original series before. And I've read Best Destiny, and I've read, some of the other ones. And a lot, I think, have been covered here on Literary Treks. But it takes a fairly deft hand to really look at that triumvirate of Kirk, McCoy, and Spock, and be able to lift one of them out and have the remaining relationship portrayed like she did. I mean, like, she took McCoy out of that situation, and Kirk and Spock were a little lost at times, or especially Spock, without McCoy. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's not something we've ever really gotten to see on screen before, because even at the end, kind of Star Trek 2 and 3, Spock was more or less out of that equation for a while, but we never really got to see Kirk and McCoy interact, because McCoy was going crazy through the whole third movie. He was really in the loony bin at one point. So we didn't really get to see Kirk and McCoy interact with each other without Spock as much, as we really got in this book of Kirk and Spock together. And the way that she described it, like you said, like the depressurizing, or, just their ability to interact with each other and help Kirk to make the decisions he needs to and lead in the way he needs to. It really did show that, you know, Kirk and Spock can still do good without McCoy, but McCoy really is necessary for the decision tree, or I don't know, you know, for Kirk's leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point about McCoy and Kirk. You know, we do see them interact, of course, in Star Trek II specifically. I think of them being there for one another, and I think McCoy is just always the character with Kirk who can say what needs to be said without a lot of sugarcoating. You know, he might bourbon coat it though. And so,
yes.
Which is always great. Or Romulan ale coat it. But, he has this ability to be able to help Spock find the equilibrium between his ultra passionate Vulcan side and human side. And again, I think the way she writes this, the idea of almost that McCoy is that pressure valve for Spock, like the pressure valve we had on the Quake moon. And I thought that was just really, really well written. And, you know, and the way in which McCoy helps Spock be able to regulate that about himself, the two halves. And which I really appreciate, because when you think about who Spock becomes, especially, I always go back to Star Trek VI, where he is so utterly comfortable now with who he is. Half human and half Vulcan, really merged into being just Spock. You know, the character who can say, you know, that knowledge is only the beginning of wisdom. You know, and so I think there's just something really spectacular about the way Carrie is able to put her finger on that and then explore that in the way in which then Kirk has to try to pick up the slack for McCoy not being there to help his friend. And I think it's also just really cool because it shows how much Kirk really does understand the people around him. He understands his friends, right? He actually understands his own role in their friendship. You know, so there's a lot of depth there without having to spend copious amounts of time on this. It's just, I think she handles it so deftly, and it was really, really something that kind of touched me and really changed my thought process on their relationship in general, which was, I didn't, you know, you read these books and you don't necessarily expect that, but to have her actually impact the way that I now think of their relationship as I move forward and I watch things, you know, again and read other books, I think that she should really be praised for that.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and, you know, she was one of the creators, I guess, of this New Earth series, and she co-wrote the first book with somebody else. I can't remember who now. But you know, it seemed like this whole series was about kind of taking the characters, like kind of our 7 main characters, and splitting them off into different groups. And really this whole time, like, this is really the first time that Kirk and Spock are without McCoy. McCoy's off doing something else. And I think that, I mean, we had those stories without Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, like, at all or much, you know, and I think it was implied that they maybe were split up at that point. But, you know, we had like the, it was Sulu, Chekhov, and I think Uhura story or something like that. And so I like that this one's kind of continuing that tradition of like, okay, let's take these pairings or these groups and just kind of jumble them up a little bit and put them in different groups. And so we've actually done that this time again with Uhura and McCoy. And really giving Uhura a chance to shine in this book by really being kind of a badass with, especially when Billy Maidenshore comes back, our criminal like, mastermind from the first book, and, you know, finally comes back, and she and McCoy are being held captive by him, but because of Maidenshore's infatuation with Uhura, he's kind of more or less torturing McCoy and kind of showering her with, comfort, and she even gets put in like the former captain's quarters of the ship that she's on. And she really gets a chance to save the day, but watching her and McCoy interact with each other, who I don't feel like we really ever see them paired up very much, that was really fun, because it really showed that they still know each other and know how each other works, to where they work well off of each other. Yes. And their personalities aren't changing just because they're with somebody else. They still are who they are. But, this is a situation where Uhura knew that she was maybe better suited to kind of take the lead, than McCoy was. Yeah,
I mean, the whole idea of having Maiden Shore back was really interesting to me. So we'll talk about him in a minute, but I think you're 100% right. I love the relationship here between Uhura and McCoy and them getting to interact. And Uhura really utilizing all of her skills, realizing exactly how to play this guy. Realizing that if she kind of plays the dumb damsel in distress, which she is not, which this whole book shows that she's clearly not, she just plays that part to get what she needs from him. And she plays him completely. And I think it's really, really awesome to see. And then, of course, this is not McCoy's specialty, right? But the way in which they are able to interact together, they work well as a team. And I thought that was really well done. And McCoy is kind of willing, especially to play along in the sense of not quite be himself, the way he might interact with a captor like this, because he's the one who encouraged Uhura to play this up. He's the one who kind of, so they work really, really well together, and they come up with this plan, and Uhura enacts it, and then continues the plan, and it's a great part of the book. Like, it really, really is. And then, of course, you mentioned the criminal element with Maiden Shore being back, and I was fascinated by the way this character plays out, because of course he got introduced in the first book, but here he just seems so relevant because he's somebody who knows how to use what people want to hear against them. He tickles their ears and he steals right out from under them, right? And people, and Uhura even says something like this, the idea that people just swallow his BS and then they pay for it. And he truly is a character of our age, right? I mean, how many people do we kind of see in our world like this who you can see them for the fraud they are, and yet so many people are following them, and because they're hearing what they want to hear. And this is not like a political thing. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm saying if you look across the spectrum of our world, you can see this playing out in many different spheres, in every different sphere. People like this, and you're just like, how are people not seeing it?
Right. Well, he's somebody who has a lot of charisma. He uses it for bad, and even on the ship that they're on, it's a bunch of prisoners, and he's good enough, like
so
you
he
said.
Has plus 10 charisma?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And like you said, to the point where he could tell people what they want to hear, where they'll just give him anything, or he's at least able to take it from them. And, he's the kind of person that I think he's not going to get his hands dirty unless he has to, meaning like if he can get somebody else to do the dirty work, he will. And I mean, we've seen that in the first book, and we're seeing that here. But we also see that he's a coward, which shouldn't be, I guess, that much of a surprise, in reading it. But once Uhura is able to get into the computer system and, you know, help basically defeat the ship that they're currently on. And, you know, the temperature is just getting colder and colder, and, you know, everyone's starving, and they play McCoy for dead practically, you know, as the, you know, she says she's only surviving long enough to make sure he dies. And basically it's all a ruse, but she's playing his own game back at him, and he's almost, I don't know how to say it, but he's kind of dumb enough to believe it, you know, because he doesn't know what else to do to fix the ship. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's kind of a comical take on it towards the end, but it's funny because it's also true to Star Trek, the original series, and, you know, kind of how, you know, Kirk would always play people against themselves,
right,
you know,
right.
especially when he's talking down the computers or the androids or whatever. And, you know, Uhura's and McCoy are almost essentially doing that here too. And so, you know, she basically exposes him for who he really is. And even once they've got him, you know, kind of under their control, you know, McCoy asks her, like, what are you going to do about the rest of it? And she's like, I've got a very cold knife against everyone's neck, meaning I'm not going to turn the temperature back up until everyone gets in their rooms, and then I'll give them heat and food and everything. And I felt like the treatment of Maiden Shore in this book was so much better than in the first book, because I know that they had to introduce him at some point. I almost don't really know that they needed to, just because that was, you know, book 1. This is book 6. Like, I'd almost forgotten about him. And so when he showed back up, it's like, oh, right, he's still around. He's, you know, and so it was fun, you know, kind of thinking back on him from the first book. But from what I remember from the first book, he was really just a foil for Kirk, or, you know, for the wagon train to the stars. And this time he felt more villainous, not even like a mustache twirling villain, but like an actual, like, oh no, this is somebody that could do some damage here. And, you know, which makes it even better that Uhura and McCoy were able to defeat him.
No, I think you nailed it. Like, there's absolutely nothing I can add to what you said, because that's exactly how I felt as well. You know, and all in all, I would say this is 100% better book than the first one as well. This one just flowed so much better. And part of that had to do with exactly what you just said. Everything felt more organic to the story in a way that it didn't quite all line up in the first one. And so, and here too, I mean, what's really interesting is that we are introducing a whole new set of characters with the USS Peleilu, and they play a pivotal part in this story as much as our characters from the Enterprise. And we get introduced to a couple of really pivotal characters, which is, I would say, Crazy Captain Lake and Nick Keller, who ends up being thrust into the role of command by getting the Battlefield Commission of being made the first officer. And he has to try to figure out command, which is, you know, a couple of questions that get posed, especially with conversations with Kirk, is command the beginning or the end of freedom? And he gets told by Kirk that, you know, command is having the spine to choose between wrong and wrong. And I absolutely loved the way this played out. It was basically us, I felt like, getting an opportunity to see what it would have been like to serve under Matt Decker, but actually play that out. And the storyline here, I thought, was excellent.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny because I read this book years and years ago. And for some reason, I was under the impression that, like, Kirk and the Enterprise, they were gone, that it was focused solely on this Peleilu ship that becomes Challenger or something like that. But having these moments, we got the crazy captain who we know that, as little breadcrumbs are dropped throughout the story, something happened in the past that's potentially driving him crazy. But at the same time, we're not totally sure, because sometimes what he's doing turns out to be accurate, or, like the right choice. And it was a happenstance. Did he actually know what was going on? We don't know. But yeah, like you said, this scene with Kirk and Keller was so good. Kirk was so kind of lackadaisical in the way that he, just showed up on the ship. He's wearing his cool, coat from Star Trek II, like the big Starfleet's answer to a pea coat, I think is how she described it. And that scene, or the kind of Kirk speech, I guess, to Keller of being in command isn't always about choosing between right and wrong, because sometimes, making a wrong decision now is better than making a right decision 5 minutes from now when death is 4 minutes away, or something to that effect. And, the quote that you gave, that having the spine to choose between wrong and wrong, I felt like was so good. It was what the character needed to hear. I felt like it's almost a good life lesson for the reader, that, if you're in a position where you have to make a decision, sometimes you have to choose between two wrongs, and do you choose the lesser wrong or the, whatever? And you don't always have the luxury of time, and, and that's things you learn in, when you're thrust into command. This guy went from second officer to first officer to eventually commander in the course of this book. And just like some of the other story elements we were talking about, it felt organic to the story. It didn't feel like it didn't feel rushed. I mean, the same thing happens with Ezri Dax in the post Deep Space Nine books, when she's like the second officer, and she ends up being captain just because everyone dies. And, this is another situation, and I don't think it's an unrealistic situation. He couldn't just give over command to Scotty or to whoever was around. He really had to do it, and I thought he was a really interesting character and a really good one to... He's clearly somebody who wants to make the right decisions, and needed that speech from Kirk to tell him sometimes you have to make the wrong decision, and it's still going to be the best one.
Yep. I 100% agree with you, and I think what they did here with the character was just so interesting and well done, because I think what Carrie does here is a great exploration of what it means to be in command, and the things that we see Kirk do all the time, right? And I loved the way that Kirk explained it to him as well, which is to say, look, I'm not always making the decision between right and wrong. I'm making the decision on between what's the lesser evil decision here, because we don't always have a clear-cut right and wrong in a situation. It's about how many less people will die with the decision I make, right? And that's not a right and wrong decision. And so I just think the whole conversation here works out so beautifully, and then it's not just the fact that they have the conversation, but it's the way in which then that is supported with the rest of the story, the rest of the choices that Keller then has to make throughout the rest of the story. And I thought that was really great. And there's some quirky, interesting things that happen from characters from the Peleilu, which I don't know necessarily completely fit into the rest of the story, but I don't feel like it's not necessary really to go into them, because I don't think it takes away from the actual important story which is being told, which is, okay, we know what it is for Kirk to be in a command. We've seen that, right? So what is it for somebody to learn what it means to be in the command that's not Kirk? And that's what we get here with Keller, and that's what I think makes this so interesting as a character study.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, kind of taken individually, even those quirky characters, yeah, some of them you could potentially lift out of the story and it wouldn't be any different. I don't think any of them detract necessarily, but by the end of the book, too, they have all, well, I was going to say they've all learned to work together, but that's not even it, as much as Keller has learned how to use people, including the one, and I can't even remember her name, but she spoke in broken English and she was like an observer or something like that for her planet.
Zoe. Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, I'm not sure anybody really ever liked working with her, but he finally got to the point where he knew how to command her when he needed her, you know, to do the right thing, to not just fight or whatever. But
well, and that connected so well with what we talked about with Kirk and Spock and his understanding of what made his command crew so special. Is the way that they were able to work together. They had become family, and that transcended a lot of the types of things that you would get in other commands, you know? And he realized, you know, in all honesty, how lucky he was because of that. So I really thought that, again, she's just doing a great job here of making all of these connections between the stories. I do have to ask you a question because we build a new starship in 17 days out of a lot of disparate pieces from other starships in this starship graveyard that we have on Belle Terre. How did this play for you in the story? Because this, you know, all the things that we do in Star Trek, this seemed to kind of push the, no, that's not possible button a little bit too hard.
You know, yeah, that was actually the exact thought I was having as I read, you know, throughout that section. And it was, this is, I guess, another part where Carrie kind of, she makes me not care about that as much, because it was still, you know, when Keller says to McCoy, or not to McCoy, to Scotty, when Keller says to Scotty, I need a new starship, you know, to help protect the planet, Scotty says, well, that's great, I can build it for you, but you have to tell me what you want. You have to tell me what it is. And so Keller has to, again, like, even he's even getting life lessons from Scotty here. And then Carrie did such a good thing with, we've got all of these destroyed ships from all of the other books. You know, we've watched this whole fleet of ships get decimated. And so for them to build a new starship out of those old pieces, I don't have as much of a problem with that. And I suppose if anybody can do it, it's Scotty. But
yes.
The part that was that did have me scratching my head a little bit, and I just had to kind of say, you know what? We're getting to the end of the book. We can't make this stretch out for months. 16, 17 days? Okay, sure. Like, I mean, I don't know how long those days were, but that was kind of the one part of the story that I was like, yeah, that seems a bit, even for Star Trek, seems a bit out there.
I think that the part that was the hardest for me as well, and I agree with everything else you said, though, about, I think, why it ends up working for the story and why you don't necessarily care. But I think just the hardest part about it was the idea that all of these ships are not like Starfleet issue, right? And so you're mixing and matching all of these different types of ships, even, you know, Quad and Blood ships, right? So you're even mixing different aliens tech in with that, and it's all, that means that how all that works together is a lot harder. I mean, Scotty mentions a little bit of it when he starts talking about, like, the software that you have to write for all of these things to interface and whatnot. And so it touches a little bit on the craziness of this idea. And then it's just like, whatever. And in many ways, I think you're right, because it's more, Carrie does such a great job of making this more about the character development than really the reality of it, that I'm okay with it. It is just something that's kind of funny that, we build a new class of Starship, the Mongrel, in 17 days, and so, and then actually, I mean, the design of it seems like it would actually be really beneficial, if you sat down and rethought it and made it basically more with natural Starfleet tech. This type of Starship design had some advantages to it in the way it's able to turn and everything, especially for maneuverability and battle and that kind of stuff. So all that stuff was great. I just it would have been interesting to see this again. But another really interesting part of this story is the way in which the Blood and the Claude realize that the Federation is here to coexist. The Federation is not about domination, and that we find a way as the Federation to coexist for mutual benefit. It's like the Michael Scott axiom. It's a win-win-win, and I love that the Blood had actually chosen to ally with us, and then the Claude end up having a reason to ally with us as well here, and come to the realization that, this is not about one being over the other. This is about mutual benefit. And, that's a really Star Trek point of view.
And especially to find out that 'cause the Blood with Shakurian has kind of been an ally for a while now. I think, happened several books ago. But Valengaith, who's the Claude leader, once he kind of tells his story, it sounds like they've been actually suffering for a while as far as, fighting this darkness that, we'll talk about in a minute, but that basically, when they were attacking the Peleilu earlier in the book, they only had a handful of people on each of their ships. Like, they were in no position to be attacking, but it was kind of in their nature. And, by the end of this book, they're kind of at the end of their rope, really, and they don't have a lot of choice, but at the same time, I think they've now realistically come to the realization that, the Federation are trying to coexist and that maybe they can too. And I mean, they're ready to die. They're like, kill us or don't or whatever, but just, maybe save our people. Like, we're like literally laying down at your feet, because we just don't know what else to do. And, at the end, like Shakurian and, Kirk and everybody are kind of like, well, no, we're not going to kill you. We're going to, we can be friends. Like, let's figure everything out together. And you're right. I mean, you don't get much more Star Trek than that. And having Valengaith come to them really of his own volition rather than capturing him and then, talking at him to convince him, I think was it was just, again, as on par with the characters. It worked with the story. And even when he came onto their ship and was like, we surrender, we this is a truce, whatever you want. There was like a little bit of like, oh, is this a ruse or what's going on? But at the same time, it felt believable and she wrapped it up quickly. Didn't draw it out or anything. It was nice.
Well, and that's where we finally bring all things together. In the sense that we find out that the Claude have fallen victim to that blot of darkness from Belle Terre that the Rattlesnake was looking into, and that Kirk and Spock have been pursuing through what they find out is that the probes that have been attacking and pulling out the Olivium are a part of this race of beings that are called, I mean, there's a few different names they have for them, but one of them is the Formless. And they're kind of partially in our universe, but not in our universe at the same time. And they kind of come up with the idea of like the submarine theory, that there's always this little portion of them that's kind of like poking out into our universe. And so, I mean, I guess like the interdimensional beings from Indy 4, the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. That's what these people are, basically. And we learn about all this because Kirk and Spock are able to make contact with them, and their lead person to speak to us is Mitch Dugan, who's the captain of the scout ship that got destroyed, quote unquote, from the first book, who was saved by the Formless, and they're wanting to get basically back in the game of like what it means to be kind of alive, in the sense they've spent all of this time kind of lounging about and enjoying their four-dimensional nature, and they want to get back to exploring because they've seen, the Federation coming into this part of space, the blood and the clod, and so we bring everything together, which I love the way that Carrie is able to do that, because that was a story thread which we're like, is this ever going to get picked up on again? And it actually brings all of this, really all the dangling threads from this story for the most part together.
Yeah. The one thing that I really wish we would have gotten was just even just little seeds of this throughout the other books, like having it the first and a little bit in the second book, and then not getting it till now. I mean, with Mitch Dugan, when he showed up, I was like, who is this guy? And then it was like at the beginning of the next chapter that he explains to Kirk who he is. I'm like, oh, right. When was that? And but the way it kind of cleans everything up, and it's just, again, it's another species that sees the Federation, they're far surpassed, anything that humanity is at this point. But they see what it could be, and they're like, we want to get back in that game again. And, just because of this. And I think,
you're the inspiration.
Yes, exactly. But they, and it even kind of cleans up the whole Olivium thing. Like there's this huge priceless mineral that we found. And, we're reading it kind of, throughout as we've been talking about these books, going, oh, maybe this is how they came up with this or that or the other thing, that we see in like Star Trek The Next Generation and beyond. And they don't make it completely go away, but at the same time they kind of make it so that we're not going to be seeing it in the quantities that we've been seeing it in these 6 books. Like they've been collecting it again and putting it back basically into the moon, to kind of that big reset button that we always need at the end of Star Trek episodes, but at the same time it didn't feel out of place or anything.
Like you said, that this is an industrial byproduct for this race. And, for us, it's priceless. It's more valuable than platinum and gold and jewels, because of what it can do for us technologically. So one of the things that we kind of discussed in the other books was the idea of how the Olivium might change the Federation and the technology. And Spock even talks about that in this book, and how, what this could do for the next 200 years. So I think we kind of have a little bit of an answer in the sense of, even Carrie here, I think, giving us an understanding of why technology advances so quickly from the original series to the Next Generation. When you think of like things like, holo projectors and all of that kind of stuff, holo decks and all of that, matter replication is much more easily accessible in the Federation and all that. You wonder, did that come from research into Olivium? Because they have a bunch of it, because Kirk barters with the Formless to, if we help you out to help stop this, neutralizer that's gone rogue, this machine that's gone rogue, which is basically what this darkness is, we help you do that. We get to keep the rest of the Olivium. And they're like, okay. And so I loved, again, how a lot of things we kind of actually talked about in the previous series, Carrie wraps up, not in many ways with a nice little bow, right? But it feels earned by this point. Like we finally are getting the answers to the questions that we had all this time, and it feels good.
Yeah. Well, and I love at the end when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are finally all reunited, and Spock is giving us a little glimpse of that future by kind of pushing McCoy's buttons a little bit by saying, someday we might be able to replace doctors, and we're going to have programmable doctors. And, of course, my mind goes to the Doctor on Voyager. And so, and that was just a cute little scene at the end. But, I thought just the way this got wrapped up, some of it happened pretty quick, but it's like there was no like Deus Ex Machina here or anything that was just like, oh, boom, the story's over and everybody's fine. Like this whole book, just wrapped some of those threads that have been dangling for a while that we've been waiting for in a fairly satisfactory ending, I'd say, for this series. Mm-hmm. And something where I could see, and I know that they do, one of the Gateways novels was a Challenger novel. It's been years since I've read that, but at the end of this book, I could see where they were trying to go by creating kind of a new original crew for a book series.
No, 100% with you. So I got a question then as to what you would end up rating this final book of the New Earth series.
Yeah, I would give this one, well, I rated it 4. I could really probably be convinced to give it a 4.5. I don't know. I don't really have much else to say except that, it was a satisfactory conclusion to what was a very rough 6 books. There were some ups and downs, and I'm just really glad it ended on an up. So yeah, I would I would give this 4, potentially 4.5 stars.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, man. I was thinking about this, and I think that I would give this 4.5. If you saw it on Goodreads, it would be a 4, and that's because it's closer to a 4 than it is a 5, but I still think it's more than that. And I think this is actually a really well done wrap up, and it makes me wish that this book was more what the original book was, because the first book in the series I didn't love. And I think Carrie just knocked this one out of the park, though. And that's fantastic that happened. I'm really thankful that was the case because, we dedicated part of the year to covering this. And so the fact that we actually ended this well is really fun, and I thought it was a great book. So I'm right there with you. I'd give this a 4.5 out of 5.
Well, that was an interesting series to go through, and I'm glad we're through it because I'm excited for where we're going in the future. If you're listening to this now, I think in the US and Canada, our next book, which is Star Trek Deep Space Nine Warped, will be 99 cents for the ebook. So make sure if you haven't read that, pick it up and read it. I don't think I've ever read it, so I'm excited to get into that one. How about you, Matthew?
Yeah. I love that you let people know what's coming up because, pick that up right now. As we're recording this, it is 99 cents, and I think it still will be by the time this comes out. So that is absolutely worth picking up. And then, of course, make sure you get Second Self, the new Picard novel coming out from Una McCormick, because we will be covering that as well here. And so I am very excited. We have, I think, a fantastic lineup coming. We have we're going to kind of go back and forth between the different Star Trek series. So like Deep Space Nine or The Next Generation, the original series, and Voyager, as well as some more Deep Space Nine we have on the list. And so we're going to try and just go in and have some fun covering some stuff that we've never covered here, of course, on the show. But just as we're coming to you each and every month, mixing it up as well. So I'm very excited to do that. But Casey, if people wanted to catch up with you, where would they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on social media at Knitting Trekkie. I'm on Goodreads, Letterboxd, Twitter, Instagram. You can also find me poking around in the Babel Conference on Facebook. And you can also find me on another podcast I do called Mickey's Marvels, where we discuss anything and everything under the Disney umbrella. And as we're recording this, D23 is coming up this weekend, and so expecting a lot of news about that and looking forward to it.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm going to be very interesting to see what they announce there. But you could find me all over social media under the name Matt Rushing02, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero. You can also find me here on the network. We have an entire side of the network not devoted to Star Trek, but everything else we love, and that's called the 602 Club. So I hope you will check that out. You can also find me, of course, doing The Orb with Chris Jones about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Warp 5 about Star Trek Enterprise, The Artificial Tango about Star Trek Picard, as well as Saddle Up about a Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, I've got a completed show with Drea Kaufman. We talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. That show is called Owl Post. And last but not least, the great John Mills and I do Aggressive Negotiations, which is a Star Wars podcast. But thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.